kala in a Shabbos nele kabla Shabbat lechu v'nelecha ki mekora beracha merosh mikedem nesucha sof ma'aseh b'machshava tchila
L'chadodi, likras kala. A new tune to a very traditional Friday night song from Zusha on their new album, Open the Gates. How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us on a Tuesday night? Shandor in the Bronx, Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey, Yehuda in Florence, South Carolina, Stephen in New Hampshire, Nancy in North Carolina, James in Annapolis, Patrice in Utah, PK in Colorado, John in Maine, John in Scotland. Welcome. Burning the Midnight Oil. Lindsay in Cincinnati, Ruth in Kentucky, Paul in the Great Northwest, Tom in PA, Bella in Florida, Karen in Northern California. Tom, working on his synagogue newsletter. Okay. Guy in Dayton, Ohio. Nancy loves the music. Annie in Michigan. Janice in Dallas. Welcome, everybody. What is that? Okay, Yitzhak in Kansas City. Aoife in Florida. Over on the YouTube side. Welcome, welcome. Okay, big page. Let's just get into it. Today's daf is page 21. We're continuing the Gemara, the commentary on Mishna number 3 here in chapter 2 of Tractate Yevamos, the 14th volume of the Talmud. And now we're looking kind of specifically today at how the rabbis will draw one of those fences around the Torah, adding to the prohibited relationships that would be deemed incestuous relationships under written law in the Torah, and then sort of, going one generation out or one more, stepfathering or stepmothering out, so to make sure that people, won't come to violate one of the written transgressions. The rabbis will issued decrees that would sort of widen that fence, widen that range of prohibitions, so that people wouldn't mistakenly or in confusion or just be drawn too near the transgression and end up violating a written Torah law. So we pick this up right at the bottom of page 20b. I'm not reading the last sentence of yesterday's argument. We ended literally one sentence before the end, and I'm not picking that up because that sentence by itself out of context won't make sense. You could just add that one to yesterday's page. So but the last sentence of the page belongs to today's discussion. So it was stated with regard. Let me just double check this is okay. It was stated with regard to the case of a high priest who engaged in intercourse with a widow who was his Yevama, requiring levirate marriage, right? So a high priest has a brother. His brother must be his paternal brother. So this brother, it's probably a full brother, but it could be a paternal half-brother. But in any case, since Yibum applies, we know if it is a half-brother, that is a paternal half-brother, and therefore his brother is a priest too. The brother was married. He didn't have any children, and then the brother died. And now the brother's wife comes before the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, for Yibum. So as we learned, the high priest cannot marry her because a high priest can only marry a woman who is neither divorced nor widowed, right? She has to be a virgin. That's spelled out in the written Torah. Now, we might have thought that since the obligation to marry your brother's widow in order to build up his house, that overrides the prohibition on a brother ever being with his brother's wife, that it would also override the prohibition of a high priest marrying a woman who would normally be disqualified from marrying him, but it doesn't, right? So that positive mitzvah to perform yibum will override the negative commandment on do not sleep with, do not lay with, do not marry your brother's wife. But that is a particular exception that the Torah itself spells out. And it won't override both the negative commandment, don't be with your brother's wife, and the positive commandment, the high priest shall marry a virgin of Israel, one who is neither widowed nor divorced. So he's not supposed to, but the brothers, so he's supposed to perform chalitza with her, but he didn't, right? So in this example that's given here, he wasn't supposed to perform intercourse with her and thereby marry her, but he did, okay? So it was stated with regard to the case of a high priest who engaged in intercourse with a widow who was his Yevama, requiring yibum. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar disputed the matter. One said that this intercourse, which would create a marriage, except he's not allowed to marry her. So the question is, well, but he did it. So is he married? Yes. But he has to give her the get now because it was not a legal marriage, or at least according to one opinion. Another opinion would be, well, the marriage never was a marriage since he's not permitted to marry her. In either case, since the brother that died had two wives, is the second one exempt, right? Did his sleeping with one illegally, as it were, because he's a high priest, exempt the other wife, the co-wife, from needing anything, right? She can't do yibum, but now maybe she's exempt from chalitza. Or you might say, well, he was supposed to perform chalitza with one of them. He performed intercourse, which was prohibited. So maybe he still has to perform chalitza with the other. So one of these guys, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar, disputed the matter. One said that intercourse does not exempt her rival wife, who had also been married to the high priest's brother, since the act of intercourse was prohibited, and the other of these two sages said that it does exempt the co-wife, because although intercourse was forbidden, it is nevertheless a valid enactment of yibum, and so her rival wife is thereby exempt. Now we're on 21a. As for a widow from marriage, as opposed to a widow from betrothal, a widow from marriage, everyone agrees that this does not exempt the rival wife, as a positive mitzvah does not override a prohibition and a positive mitzvah together. The Kohen Gadol cannot marry a woman who's divorced or a widow. He must marry a virgin. Also, you're not allowed to be with your brother's wife, but that gets overridden by every yibum. Now, when the sages disagree, it is in the case of a widow from betrothal. So maybe they agree that a widow from marriage, no good, and that the act of intercourse with her doesn't do anything that would exempt the co-wife from chalitza, the alternative mitzvah of chalitza. However, if she was only a widow from betrothal, so that she was married to the brother, but since they never consummated that marriage, she's still a virgin. So the one who said that it exempts the rival wife holds that the positive mitzvah, when they disagree, is in the case of a widow from betrothal. The one who said that it exempts the rival wife holds that the positive mitzvah of yibum comes and overrides the prohibition against a high priest marrying a widow. And the one who said that it does not exempt the co-wife held that the positive mitzvah of yibum does not come and override a prohibition, since it is possible to perform chalitza. And the Gemara raises an objection to the opinion that the co-wife would not be exempt from the previously cited baraisa. Yesterday's baraisa. if one of those Yevamim, one of those surviving brothers, engaged in intercourse, so he acquired her as a wife. And this shows that the act of Yibum is valid even when it's prohibited. If so, in the case of a high priest and a widow as well, her rival wife should be exempt because he slept with her. He shouldn't have, but he did. So he acquired her as a wife. Maybe he's not going to be allowed to keep her as a wife, and he's going to have to give her a valid bill of divorce. But he acquired her as a wife, and therefore the co-wife should be exempt from chalitza. This is a conclusive refutation, and that opinion is rejected. And the Gemara asks, shall we say that this is also a conclusive refutation of the opinion of Reish Lakish, and therefore reject his principle? And the Gemara answers, Reish Lakish could have said to you, when I say that in every place that you find a positive mitzvah and a prohibition applying to the same matter, if you can fulfill both of them together without transgressing the prohibition, this is best. And the positive mitzvah does not override the prohibition. This is applicable only when the mitzvah is fulfilled properly. But here, chalitza in place of yibum is not considered a proper fulfillment of the mitzvah. Wait a minute. Haven't you heard me say here before that today we actually follow the case or the law that if this comes up today, right? So if there's two brothers and one of them dies young before having kids and he leaves a wife, and there's a surviving brother, can that surviving brother and the widow perform yibum? Technically, yes. Very much discouraged. We prefer they perform chalitza. And chalitza is performed. This doesn't come up very often. But when it does, and there's pious people involved, they will go before a beis din and perform chalitza. Why? We prefer that they perform chalitza. Why? We worry that if they perform yibum, the kavanah, the intention, won't be pure. They can only sleep together in order to provide an heir for the brother that died, right? To build up his house, to continue his name among the children of Israel. But if they have any kind of feelings of attraction for each other, then somehow, then it's not good. That they would actually not really be yibum. And since we can never be sure, we encourage them, listen, that's your brother-in-law's wife. I mean, it's your... To the widow, this is your brother-in-law. To the brother-in-law, this is your brother's wife. Just perform chalitza and go your separate ways and, marry other people and raise families. So it would seem that we hear from the Gedolim, the big rabbis of our generation, no, chalitza is preferable. But here we're reading Reish Lakish is saying, no, it is preferable to perform yibum. And we would get that from the wording of the chalitza ceremony where, it said, she says about the brother that such is done. She pulls off the sandal publicly, or it's really done in front of a rabbinic court. So is done to the man who will not build up his brother's house in Israel. It's sort of like a mark of shame. He should have done it, but he's not doing it. Okay. It is allowable, is permissible according to Torah law to perform chalitza instead of yibum, but yibum would be better, says Reish Lakish. So which is it? Rava said, where is the prohibition? And now they're going to actually change the subject a little bit. It may well be that in an ideal world, yibum would be preferable to chalitza, and the reason that in modern times we say we don't do it, right, is this justification, this rationale that we can't be sure it's done with a pure intent, and that's going to, sort of avoid the whole mess of it. Also, there's the issue that we don't allow multiple spouses anymore. Right? So, the other brother may have had his own plans in life, might have his own wife already. And since, we don't have multiple spouses, that would be another reason why, yibum is definitely not happening in modern times. But whereas in ancient times, having multiple wives certainly could happen and did. And so it was less of a disruption, as it were, if yibum was performed. Now, Rava said, where is the prohibition against secondary prohibited relationships hinted at in the Torah? So we were getting at this in the Mishnah that we're now discussing, Mishnah number 3, that the rabbis by decree defined certain relationships. They're going to talk about the fact that there are secondary relationships for a few paragraphs before they spell out what the secondary prohibited relationships are that are going to be prohibited to a Jew. You can't marry, like your grandmother's, I can't even remember. They get a little complicated, your stepson's daughter's daughter, etc. But it's sort of like, the Torah will define, 15, 20 prohibited relationships. People that if they were together, they would violate a prohibition, a chorus bearing prohibition. And then the rabbis added to that list because it's a little bit too close to the relationships that are on the list. And it's this fence around the Torah. So first we're going to get how the rabbis came to do that. So where is the prohibition against secondary forbidden relationships hinted at in the Torah? Right? They're obviously not spelled out, or then there would just be sort of Torah prohibitions. But where are these secondary relationships hinted at in the Torah? As it is stated at the end of the portion discussing forbidden incestuous relations, for all these abominations have the men of the land done. Leviticus 18:27. And the word these must be understood to mean the harsh ones, i.e. the severe transgressions. And this proves by inference that there are also lesser transgressions that are, as it were, soft ones, prohibited but not as bad as these. And what are those soft ones? They are the secondary prohibited relationships. And the Gemara asks, from where may it be inferred that the word these is an expression meaning harsh? As it is written, and the mighty, Ele, of the land he took away. Ezekiel 17:13. So the similarity of these words, these in that context is ha'el, these, is an expression that is going to said to be mean harsh, because in Ezekiel, Eli, similar, that the mighty of the land he took away, and the similarity of these words implies that these also has connotations of something mighty or harsh, right? The stronger abominations, as it were. And Gemara asks, shall we say that this statement contradicts the opinion of Rabbi Levi? As Rabbi Levi said, the harshness of the punishment for using dishonest measures is more than the punishment for transgressing the prohibition of prohibited relationships. Did you get that? That if you are, running a store or any business, and you have two sets of weights, the fair one and the ones where you cheat a little bit and rip off your customers a little bit, that the act of, shading the scale in your favor so you make a few extra bucks is as bad as committing incest. Worse, according to Rabbi Levi. And he will explain. How does he know this? These, wait a minute, is more than the punishment for transgressing the prohibition of forbidden relationships. As with regard to the word this, in the case of forbidden relations, it is stated only these, whereas with regard to that, aleph lamed, whereas with regard to that dishonest measures, it is stated these, ele, right, which is aleph lamed hey, I believe, right? Aleph lamed hey, ele, where is it? Well, that's what he said. Ele, with an additional letter hey as a suffix. And for all that do these things, ele, things, these things, even all that do unrighteously are an abomination unto the Lord your God. Deuteronomy 25:16. And so this implies that the word ele indicates harshness and not the word el. And the Gemara answers, this does not contradict his opinion. The word el has the connotation of harsh, but ele has the connotation of even harsher than el. And the Gemara asks, well, with regard to forbidden relationships, the word ele is also written. For whosoever shall do any of these abominations, ele, even the souls that do them shall be cut off from among their people. Leviticus 18:29. So if so, why is the punishment for using dishonest measures considered harsher than the punishment for engaging in the prohibited relationships and committing incest? And the Gemara answers, that expression meaning these, Eila, in the context of forbidden relations, does not emphasize their severity. Rather, it comes to exclude one who uses deception in measures from the penalty of charis. And the Gemara asks, rather, in what way is deception in measurements more severe than forbidden relations? The Gemara answers, those who engage in forbidden relations have the possibility of repentance. If one engaged in relations with a forbidden relative, he can rectify that sin through repentance. In the case of those who deceive the public with dishonest measures, it is not possible to repent fully. He could atone. He could ask God to forgive him. He could engage in a process of making tshuva, atonement, so that he would never do it again. But he can never find all those customers who came into the store and that he ripped off and give them their money back. So his atonement would never be complete. And that's why, ripping off strangers in a way is worse than committing incest. Both require atonement, obviously, but you can never complete the atonement when you rip off a bunch of strangers and can't find them again. Rav Yehuda said that the prohibition of secondary forbidden relationships is learned from here. As it says with regard to King Solomon, he weighed, Izen, and sought out and set in order many proverbs. And Ula said, Rabbi Elazar said, before Solomon came, the Torah was like a basket, kefifa, without handles, oznaim, until Solomon came and made handles for it. By means of his explanation and proverbs, he enabled each person to understand and take hold of the Torah, full of its mitzvahs, and distance himself from transgressions, right? Meaning that King Solomon, in elucidating the meanings of certain mitzvahs via his own wisdom and Ecclesiastes, where he talks about performing mitzvahs, and the book of Proverbs, it was like he was acting as a very early sage and also making a bit of a fence around the Torah. And Rabbi Oshaya said that the prohibition of secondary forbidden relationships is learned from here, from Proverbs 4:15. Avoid it, pass not by it, turn from it, and pass on. One must distance himself from any prohibited act and not pass near a place of forbidden objects or situations, right? I mean, you don't have to talk to somebody who's in the program, right, of addiction recovery, a 12-step program. There's many things that 12-step programs cover, but I'm sure what they all have in common is don't put yourself in the situation and with the companions that led you to indulge in your addictive behavior before. You have to distance yourself from those situations. And likewise, you have to distance yourself from sin. Rav Ashi said a parable. To what does this matter? The opinion of Rabbi Oshaya comparable? Is comparable to a man guarding an orchard. If he guards it from the outside, all of it is guarded. But if he guards it from the inside, only that which is in front of him that he can see is guarded, while that which is behind him is unguarded, right? That same idea that, you don't want the bad guy to get inside your house, right? You don't want him to get on your property. Better, have a full fence and stop the bad guy before he gets inside, right? So you want to set up your perimeter, your personal perimeter, to have a distance from the attractions, temptations, indulgences, the sins that you might otherwise commit. You keep that distance, you're going to be safe from it. But if you let it come close, I just want to take a look. I'm not going to do it. I just want to get the smell of it. Oh, I miss it. Don't worry, I'm not going to take it. Oh, I want to be near this thing, this behavior. I'm not going to do it. And then the next thing you know, your Yetzer Hara, your evil inclination, is going to bridge the gap once you allow yourself to get close to that prohibited behavior. The Gemara comments, and this parable of Rav Ashi is a mistake and is not accurate. There, in his metaphor, that which is in front of him is at least guarded. Here, in the case of forbidden relationships, were it not for the rabbinic decrees against secondary forbidden relationships, one would eventually encounter and transgress the biblically forbidden relationship itself. Guarding from the outside is not only preferable, it is essential. You must not come close to sin because you will fall to temptation if you allow yourself to even come close. Rav Kahana said that the prohibition of secondary forbidden relationships is alluded to from here in the verse stated at the conclusion of the verses discussing the laws of forbidden relationships. It says at Leviticus 18:30, therefore you shall protect, ushmartem, you shall protect my prized possession, mishmarti, that you do not any of these abominable customs. And this means establish a safeguard, mishmeret, for my prized possessions. What are my prized possessions? The Jewish family, the holy Jewish family. Do not let prohibited relationships come in and somehow mar the Jewish family. Abaye said so don't let it even come close. Abaye said to Rav Yosef, if the prohibition against the secondary forbidden relationships is learned from here, then it would be by Torah law. Yet the prohibition against secondary forbidden relationships is by rabbinic law. And he answered him, the requirement to add an additional safeguard itself is in fact by Torah law. In other words, the sages were adding decrees, relationships not spelled out in the Torah, that are prohibited, and they added another group of relationships and said these are going to be prohibited too. Adding them, the act of adding to the list, that is by Torah law. The Torah didn't spell out these additional prohibited relationships, but it did charge the sages to add these decrees in order to protect the Jewish people from coming to commit these transgressions. Is in fact by Torah law, and the sages interpreted and define where and when to apply this law. And Abaye objected, but isn't all of the Torah also interpreted by the sages? And yet it has the force of Torah law? In that case, why are these laws considered to be rabbinic? Rather, the prohibition of secondary forbidden relationships was decreed by rabbinic law, and the verse is a mere support, but does not indicate that it is a Torah law. Either way, we don't engage in these relationships. And the sages taught in a baraisa. What are the secondary prohibited relationships that the sages prohibited by their decree? His mother's mother and his father's mother. You can't marry your grandmother, whether she's your mother's mother or your father's mother. And his father's father's wife, right? So you can't marry your grandfather's wife, even if she's not your grandmother. And his mother's father's wife, right? Your grandfather's wife, even if she's not your grandmother. And the wife of his father's maternal half-brother. The wife of his father's maternal half-brother, right? So this is your aunt-in-law, right? And the wife of his mother's paternal half-brother, another aunt, and his son's daughter-in-law, and his daughter's daughter-in-law. A man is permitted to take his father-in-law's former wife. Your father-in-law's former wife. So you could marry a woman, and then maybe she dies, and her dad's former wife, who is not your wife's mother, would be permitted, right? As opposed to these other relationships where they're prohibited. So a man is permitted to take his father-in-law's former wife, provided she is not the mother of his wife, and his stepson's wife, if the stepson died or divorced her. And he's prohibited from marrying the daughter of his stepson. And it is permitted for one stepson to marry the stepfather's wife or daughter, right? So again, the Marsha and Greg Brady situation, that when people, adults with kids get divorced and then come and marry and blend families, so Greg and Marsha Brady could marry each other. They're not related, right? If they grew up together in the same house, it would be really weird, and we would expect that not to happen. But it's not incest because they're not blood relations at all. So due to these rabbinic decrees concerning stepsons, unusual situations might arise. For example, and his stepson's wife, right? So his stepson's wife. So I marry a woman who has a son, and then that son gets married, and then my wife's son, he's my stepson, not my biological son, he dies. Could I marry his widow? I mean, it'd be weird, but it's technically possible, right? And his stepson's wife says to him that her husband's i.e. to her husband's stepfather, I am permitted to you, but my daughter is forbidden to you, which is interesting, right? So if they had a child, this is not yibum we're talking about. These are just what the secondary prohibited relationships are. So, I marry a woman, she has a son, the son gets married, so he's my stepson. He gets married, he has a daughter, they have a child, right? So I could not marry the child of that union, even though not biologically related to me, because it is a prohibited relationship. That is my wife's son's daughter. But that girl's mother, right, my stepson's wife, would be permitted, right? You'd avoid all of this, but nevertheless, they're going to define what is permitted and what is prohibited and what. Now, the Gemara challenges that which was stated in the Baraisa. His stepson's daughter is not a secondary relation by rabbinic law. She is forbidden by Torah law, since she is the daughter of his stepson, since the daughter of his stepson is the daughter of his wife's son, as it is written. So you can't marry your wife's granddaughter. As it is written, you shall not take her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter, Leviticus 18:17. And the Gemara answers, this case was included because the Baraisa wanted to teach the latter clause, which states, his stepson's wife says to him, I am permitted to you, but my daughter is forbidden to you. And although my daughter is forbidden to you by Torah law, nevertheless, the sages did not issue a decree forbidding me, meaning the stepson's wife, after, God forbid, the stepson dies. So therefore, the case of his stepson's daughter was also taught in the first clause, even though she is forbidden by Torah law and is not a secondary relation. Now, the Gemara raises an objection. If so, the Baraisa wished to teach this that the Baraisa wished to teach this peculiarity, then why did it teach his father-in-law's wife also says, I am permitted to you and my daughter is forbidden to you, as she is his wife's sister? And the Gemara answers, this matter is conclusive for him. In other words, his stepson's wife is never permitted and his stepson's daughter is always forbidden to him. But as for the matter of his father-in-law's wife's daughter, this is not conclusive for him. This ruling is not final and it might change, since if his wife dies, then her sister would be permitted to him. You can't marry a woman and her mother, right? Even if your wife dies, you can never marry her mother. You can't marry a woman and her sister. Even if you divorce your wife while she's still alive, you can't marry her sister. But after your wife dies, then it would be permitted to marry her sister. So the status can change there. Rav said that he received the tradition with regard to secondary forbidden relationships that for women have a conclusion, i.e. the prohibition does not continue to later generations, but applies only to those women who are mentioned explicitly. And Rav held 3 of them in his hand. He knew with certainty 3 of the 4 categories. They were the wife of his mother's paternal half-brother, the wife of his father's maternal half-brother, and his daughter-in-law. Their children would be permitted, but those women are prohibited. And Zeri added also the wife of his mother's father. And Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, and your mnemonic for remembering who said what is as follows: Zeri adds an extra generation on top of the prohibitions of Rav, i.e. the wife of his mother's father, which Rav did not mention. And the Gemara asks, and what is the reason that Rav did not reckon this category mentioned by Zeiri to be among those who have a conclusion? And the Gemara answers, in his opinion, the category might be mistakenly switched with the category of the wife of his father's father, which does not have a conclusion. With regard to the wife of his father, the prohibition applies equally to the wife of all ancestors in the father's line. Therefore, according to Rav, the sages also included the ancestors of the mother's father's wife as secondary forbidden relationships. And the Gemara asks, and why is Zeri not concerned that these 2 categories will become confused? Shouldn't we issue additional decrees, since the people might get confused about who's permitted and who's prohibited? And the Gemara answers, he is often found there in his father's home and goes there frequently. But here to his mother's household, he is not commonly found to go. Since he goes to his father's home frequently, He knows that his father's relatives are forbidden to him, and he will not confuse them with his mother's relatives. As you can see, it was a very patriarchal society in which they were hashing out which decrees are going to apply. People just associated through paternal homesteads, as it were. Among the women enumerated by Rav is his daughter-in-law. Now we're on 21b. And the Gemara asks, is this relationship not forbidden by Torah law? You can't marry your son's wife. As it is written, you shall not uncover the nakedness of your daughter-in-law. Leviticus 18:15. So the Gemara amends, say instead, his son's daughter-in-law. And the Gemara asks, and does the prohibition against having a relationship with his son's daughter-in-law indeed have a conclusion? Isn't it taught in a Baraisa? His daughter-in-law is a forbidden relation by Torah law. His son's daughter-in-law is a secondary forbidden relation. And similarly, you say the daughter-in-law of his son and the daughter-in-law of his son's son until the end of all generations are all prohibited forbidden relationships. Secondary forbidden relationships. Rather, say instead that Rav was referring to his daughter's daughter-in-law. And Rav Chisda said, I heard this matter from a great man. And who was that great man? It was Rabbi Ami. And he said they prohibited a daughter-in-law only due to the daughter-in-law. And Rav Chisda heard this in his youth, but did not understand the meaning. And the Chaldean astrologers said to me, you will be a teacher. Who are the Chaldeans? The term Chaldean, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but the Chaldean, Chaldean, is a synonym for Chazdian, one of the names of the Babylonian people. This term is used in the Bible as a synonym for stargazers or astrologers, as in the following verse, Daniel 2:2. Then the king commanded to call the magicians and the enchanters and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. And some sages prohibited consulting astrologers to discern the future based on the Torah injunction, you shall be wholehearted with the Lord your God. Nevertheless, many people did consult with them. Although the sages accepted the belief that astrologers had certain powers to foretell the future, they advised that astrologers should be neither consulted nor overly trusted. Right? And we learn elsewhere in the Talmud that the Jewish people have no mazel. And by that, it means that their fate is not written in the stars. Right? We have this we have this relationship that we can pray to God and we can somehow overcome whatever was fated for us according to the position of the constellations at our birth, right? So, the Torah says you cannot consult necromancers and mediums. Can you read your horoscope? Yeah, you can read your horoscope, but don't put too much faith in it. Don't depend on it too much. It is not something that is, you can do it, but it's looked down on, and you certainly shouldn't put your faith and trust into it. Okay, so Rav Chisda said, I said to myself, if the astrologers meant that I will become a great man and one who teaches the public, well, I will certainly be able to reason and understand this matter with my knowledge. If the astrologers meant that I will become the teacher of children, I will ask it of the sages who come to the synagogue, and in that way I will learn the meaning of Rabbi Ami's teaching. Now I understand the matter on my own. And Rabbi Ami meant they prohibited the daughter's daughter-in-law only due to his son's daughter-in-law, to avoid confusion between these daughters-in-law. The rabbinic decree prohibited one's daughter's daughter-in-law, but did not extend to subsequent generations. Right, so the daughter-in-law of your daughter-in-law is prohibited, but her daughter would be permitted. But the daughter-in-law of your son is prohibited, and so is the child of your son's daughter-in-law. Now, various sages proceed to give contemporary examples of families where the halakhic status of the daughters-in-law of the sons and the daughters-in-law of the daughters could be confused with each other, and that's why they created this decree. So Abaye said to Rava, I will explain to you with an example how one might become confused about these daughters-in-law. For example, this would be possible in the case of the daughter-in-law of the house of Bar Tzittai, as there the children of the sons and the daughters of the same family lived together. And it was possible to confuse the halachic status of the son's daughters-in-law and the daughter's daughters-in-law. And so Rav Papa said, for example, the daughter-in-law of the house of Rav Papa bar Abba. And Rav Ashi said, for example, the daughter-in-law in the house of Mari bar Isak. So basically what they're saying is, unlike our society, where very typically kids go off to college and then they meet their spouses and then they go live in another city. It's one of the sad things of our fractured society family-wise. But in ancient times, very typical, especially wealthy families, that they would just start to congregate around the pater familias, right? The aging patriarch would have his sons and their families living nearby, and then the grandsons and their families, granddaughters, great-granddaughters, daughters, they would get married off and they would go live with their husbands, in their paternal compound. But if it was like a really famous rich family, that would attract sort of a larger sphere. Not just sons' families, but even daughters' families might come to live with that man. And therefore, there might be this confusion of who's permitted and who's prohibited. And so the sages decreed on the daughter's daughters-in-law because of the son's daughters-in-law. Now, a dilemma was raised before the sages. What is the law with regard to the wife of one's mother's maternal half-brother? And the Gemara presents the different sides of the question. Both the wife of one's father's maternal half-brother and the wife of one's mother's paternal half-brother contain some aspect of a father. And perhaps this is the reason that the sages enacted a prohibition. That is, they were both forbidden rabbinically as incestuous relations to avoid confusion with the case of the wife of one's father's paternal half-brother. She's definitely prohibited, who is prohibited by Torah law. But in the case of the wife of one's mother's maternal half-brother, where there is no aspect of a father whatsoever, perhaps the sages did not make a decree, or perhaps this case is no different. And Rav Safra said, we are well into the B side of 21, Rav Safra said she herself, the wife of the mother's paternal half-brother, is prohibited by rabbinic decree. And will we then proceed to issue a decree to prevent violation of a decree? Now here's where we've seen this principle before. When the sages are creating that fence around the Torah to protect us from coming to violate Torah prohibitions, they don't draw a fence around the fence around the Torah. They don't issue decrees to keep us from violating rabbinic decrees, which themselves were issued to keep us from violating written Torah transgressions. Because that process could go on forever, and you'd have this huge body of law and so many prohibitions. They don't do that. They don't issue a decree on a decree. But now they're going to say, well, wait a minute. They do issue a decree on a decree. Let's see. So Rava said, she herself, the wife of the mother's paternal half-brother, is forbidden by rabbinic decree. And will we then proceed to issue a decree to prevent violation of a decree? Rava said, is that to say that all of these rabbinic decrees with regard to secondary relations are not decrees to prevent violation of a decree? For example, his mother is a forbidden relation by Torah law. You can't marry your mother. And the sages decreed that his mother's mother is a secondary prohibited relation. Okay, the grandmother is by rabbinic decree she prohibited to you. And they decreed that his father's mother is also a secondary prohibited relationship due to his mother's mother. And what is the reason? They are called the house of the grandmother, and therefore people may confuse their halakhic status, right? So you can't marry your mother. The sages then said you can't marry your grandmother, who is your mother's mother. Then they also said you can't marry your father's mother because of your mother's mother. So isn't that a decree to keep you from violating a decree? Also, the wife of his father's paternal half-brother, his uncle, who is mentioned explicitly in the Torah, you can't marry your uncle's wife after he dies. That is a prohibited relation by Torah law. And the sages decreed that the wife of his father's maternal half-brother, this is a secondary prohibited relationship to keep you from violating the uncle from your father's, the wife of coming to transgress by marrying the widow of your father's uncle. And they decreed that the wife of his mother's paternal half-brother is also a secondary forbidden relationship due to the wife of his father's maternal half-brother. And what is the reason? It is because they are all called the house of the uncle. And it seems that in the realm of forbidden relations, the sages did issue decrees to prevent violation of a decree. And then Rav Safra's claim is incorrect. Well, if so, then what is the law in the case of the wife of his mother's maternal half-brother? Come in here. As when Rav Yehuda Bar Shela came from Eretz Yisrael to Babylonia, he said, in the West, meaning in Israel, they said this principle: for every female relative who is a prohibited relation by Torah law, the sages decreed on the wife of the equivalent male relative due to her similarity to a secondary forbidden relationship. That sounds like a decree on a decree. And Rava said, is this really the established principle? Isn't his mother-in-law a prohibited relation by Torah law, while his father-in-law's wife is permitted? Also, his mother-in-law's daughter is a forbidden relation by Torah law, as she is his wife's sister, and yet his mother-in-law's son's wife is permitted. And his father-in-law's daughter is a prohibited relation by Torah law, yet the wife of his father-in-law's son is permitted. His stepdaughter is a forbidden relation by Torah law, and yet his stepson's wife is permitted. His stepdaughter's daughter, i.e. his wife's granddaughter, is a forbidden relation, and yet the wife of his stepson is permitted. And the Gemara continues, so if so, what did that statement of Rav Yehuda Bar Shaila come to include? Since his principle is not true in every case, it must be intended to include a specific law. Does it not come to include the case of the wife of one's mother's maternal half-brother, since for every female relative who is a forbidden relation by Torah law, such as his mother's maternal half-sister, the sages decreed on the wife of the equivalent male relative, in this case his mother's maternal half-brother's wife, due to her similarity to the secondary relation. That's the decree on the decree. And the Gemara asks, I'm almost done. So if you have questions or comments, get them in. So the Gemara asks, what is different with regard to these cases, the wife of his father-in-law or the wife of his mother-in-law's son, who are permitted, and this case of the wife of the maternal half-brother, who is prohibited? And the Gemara answers, this, the wife of a mother's maternal half-brother, is related by a single act of betrothal. One's mother's brother is a blood relative, your maternal uncle, and his wife is therefore a secondary relation. In contrast, these other cases, with regard to which the sages did not issue a decree, are related only when there are two acts of betrothal. For example, one's father-in-law is related to one through one's marriage to his own wife, and his father-in-law's wife is related to him through his father-in-law's marriage. It's twice removed. And Rav Misharsha from Tusnea sent a message to Rav Papi, let our master teach us what is the law with regard to the wife of a father's brother and the sister of a father's father. Did the sages prohibit these as secondary prohibited relations? And the Gemara presents the different sides of the dilemma. Since one generation below is a forbidden relation, i.e. the father's sister and the wife of a father's paternal brother, who are both forbidden by Torah law, perhaps the sages also decreed about the women one generation above. Or perhaps the generations are separate and the women in the generation above are not considered to be prohibited relatives. The Gemara attempts to answer, coming here from the Baraisa cited above, which taught what are the secondary prohibited relations that were prohibited. And these women, i.e. the wife of one's father's brother and the sister of his father's father, were not reckoned among them. And this implies that these women are permitted. And the Gemara answers, this is not conclusive. Perhaps the Tana of the Brisa taught some examples and omitted others. And the Gemara says, well, what else did he omit? That he omitted this? It cannot be that the Tana had an exhaustive list except for one case. He either left out more than one case or he included all possible cases. And the Gemara answers, he omitted the list of secondary forbidden relationships that were enumerated by the school of Rabbi Chia, which is listed later. Therefore, this Baraisa is not conclusive, as the Tana left out many cases. And we'll stop right there. Okay. Let's see if there's questions on this confusing chain of relatives. But the operative concept is, how far will the sages go in defining additional prohibited relationships by rabbinic decree in order to protect us from coming to violate the prohibited relationships that are spelled out in the Torah? And where will they refrain so that they're not multiplying decrees unnecessarily? Okay. On Yevamos 21. Are there no questions? Here, Tom. You can't atone to a mamzer if you have a child with a forbidden woman. Your sin, but the mamzer's punishment. Very good, Tom. So you were talking about when they said that if you have indulge in a prohibited relationship, well, you could make an atonement for that. But if you have faulty, cheating weights and measures, and you rip off people and you can't return what you stole from them, you could make an atonement, but you can never make full restitution. But as we actually learned earlier, if you slept with one of the prohibited relations and had a child by her, it's exactly right. Then you could never complete that atonement because you created a mamzer in the world, and unfortunately, that child will have that very challenging status through no fault of their own, which should act as a big disincentive to people to do this. Sharon, what about the Woody Allen situation? He married his wife's adopted daughter from a prior marriage. Permitted or forbidden? I mean, I think that the sages, if asked this question, would come up with a way to prohibit. It's not going to be, I think, any of these relationships which have to do with children and marriage, meaning blood children and marriage. The concept of adoption is problematic, but perhaps they haven't addressed it here, right? I think that a modern court, a Beis Din, and maybe adoption's addressed elsewhere, but I would hope that they would say that's going to be prohibited because adoption is real, right? And so you can't marry, your wife's daughter, right? For sure, you can't marry your wife's daughter. The fact that she was the wife's adoptive daughter, why should that matter if the adoption was real? So it's problematic in a lot of ways, but I'm definitely no expert on this area of law, and I don't know what the result would be. I don't think we've encountered the explicit prohibition in the Gemara yet that would prohibit that situation, but I would hope they would find a way to prohibit it. All right. Now, does Woody Allen and his second wife, who was his wife's adoptive daughter, do they have children? Right. If they do, now, do you want that relationship, which we maybe should discourage? But if you declared that it was incestuous, then the children could be mamzer, right? Now, I'm not sure. I mean, was Woody Allen's wife Jewish? I don't even know, right? Mia Farrow, is she Jewish? Guessing not, right? So the mamzer aspect of it won't apply here. But that's, one of those things where, you have to be so careful, and the sages are always being so careful, because you make a ruling to produce, to discourage a behavior, but if that ruling is absolute, somebody else could pay a price for it, right? That's why I remember in law school, and we said it many times, right? Tough cases make bad law. You want to produce an equitable solution in a very tough case, but that could have unintended consequences in other cases. So it's certainly something to be careful of should you find yourself as a rabbi seated in a Beis Din making rulings on challenging situations like this. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, for Yevamos page 22. Have a good night.